Hello, everybody. Good evening. Lovely to see you all. Yeah, I'm Rob Hopkins, and thank you very much for coming. I'm going to be talking about the power of imagination. I'm going to be talking a little bit about time travel as a tool for activists, about longing and why we need to get better at helping people to fall in love with the future. So I want to start by telling you a little story. In 1865, Jules Verne wrote a book called From the Earth to the Moon. And in that book, he pulled together all the best science he could find about what getting to the moon might actually look like. Some of it was very accurate. He said there would be 3 astronauts. The rocket would be made of aluminium. It would take off from Florida. Some of it not quite so accurate. In his book, the rocket was fired out of a giant cannon, and which we now know if you actually did that, the moment you pressed go, the astronauts would be turned to something very similar to passata in a fraction of a second. But that book inspired many, many people. Filmmakers, one of the very first films that was made was A Trip to the Moon by Georges Méliès in 1902. And in the culture, what happened was this backwards and forwards between science and storytelling and popular culture as the longing to get to the moon started to grow. There was a genre of popular science magazines that people consumed voraciously about how we might actually make this extraordinary journey. And there was even in the 1950s an astonishing genre of really, truly dreadful movies where all male crews of astronauts traveled to the moon to find that it was populated only by women. It's a very weird male fantasy that was kicking off here. And this film, I've watched it so that you don't have to. It says you've never seen anything like it, and that's quite right. And but I always look at this poster and think, you know, these men have gone all the way to the moon to find the population all women, and they look really miserable about it. You'd think that they would have been celebrating it. But there were 9 films like this, because it got deeper and deeper into our culture, this idea that we would go to the moon. Tintin, of course, very famously went to the moon, and it meant that in 1963, when JFK announced that we would go to the moon, standing in front of a man trying very hard not to sneeze, that actually we had already been there many, 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 many times in our culture. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong finally set foot on the moon, Hergé, who did the Tintin cartoons, did this cartoon for the New York Times, which is Neil Armstrong arriving and being greeted by Tintin and his friends because we'd already been there so many times. And in an article that I read about this by Michael Benson, he said, most major achievements, be they personal or collective, arrive after rehearsals. So by the time Neil Armstrong went there, we had been to the moon hundreds and hundreds of times in dances, in Mickey Mouse comics, in all sorts of different things. So we built the longing first. All big moves that we make as a species start with longing, and they start with stories. Right now, we don't have 100 years to cultivate longing in the same way that we did to go to the moon, but the same principle still applies. I'm not going to talk a lot about climate science. I have found this recently which sums it up really beautifully. Number 1, it's warming. We can all see the fact. I spoke to a gentleman here before who's a farmer who said, of course, we see the world warming all the time. Number 2, it's us. We know what's driving this process. It's humanity's consumption and addiction to fossil fuels. Oops, sorry, I've just gone the wrong way. Number 3, yes, we're sure. We know by now. There is no credible scientific voice saying that this is not what's happening. Number 4, it's bad. And it's going to get a lot worse. And if you're not regularly terrified about climate change, I would suggest that you're not paying attention. But number 5 is we can fix it. We have the solutions to stop this becoming a runaway problem. So I'm only going to show you one graph this evening, but it's really, really important. We have one tool as a global society for what we do about climate change. That's the Paris Agreement, signed in 2015. It's not perfect. It's the best thing that we have. What that does is set out a pathway of how we get from where we are now to 2050 to decarbonize society. In this talk, I'm not going to focus on that 2050 because what interests me much, much more is what that 2030 would look like if we were on target. Because if we miss that 2030, by which time, by the way, we need to have cut our emissions by 48%. That's 6 years away. That's huge. If we miss that target, and sometimes I work with companies who say, oh, 2030, that's very soon. Couldn't we make it 2040? And I always say, well, I'm not here to negotiate with physics. Let's figure out how we actually do this. So what would it be like to be in that 2030 where we had done everything we possibly could have done to get there? So I have just spent the last month on a very delightful speaking tour all around Portugal with my friends here. And the place that I traveled from is a small town in the southwest of England called Totnes, and it's where the transition movement started. It's also, I think, possibly more importantly, the place where we have a very secret time travel research program. Thank you. We have developed the world's first successful time machine project. We're kind of the Cape Canaveral of time travel research, really. And deep underneath our castle in our laboratory, we've been working very hard to develop the capacity to travel through time. And in case you're still wondering, think, well, that's, of course you don't. This is my colleague, Mr. Kit, and together, using the technology we've created, we travel regularly to 2030, not just any 2030, the 2030 that's not a utopia, not a dystopia, it's only 6 years away after all, but it's the 2030 that resulted from us doing absolutely everything we could have possibly done. And we travel there to take photographs, to make sound recordings, to talk to people, to hear their stories, to bring that back to 2024, to help people fall in love with the future. As the poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. If as activists all we do is talk about collapse and extinction all the time, we're not doing that. So maybe there's a different way that we could do that. So in our time machine, we visit the amazing underground mushroom empires of 2030, where the food, the medicines, the construction materials are being produced. We visit the amazing regenerative agricultural systems that have swept the world by storm in such a short period of time. And just in case, my friends, you are still thinking, I don't believe that you can travel through time, Rob, that's ridiculous, come on. I have some evidence for you. I have a little piece of film that a friend of mine filmed in my kitchen the other day, of my wife in the kitchen, and you'll see in the background me heading off on one of my time traveling adventures. Hopefully this will put any doubt in your mind at rest. Thank you. Seriously, if I don't win the Nobel Prize this year, I'm going to be very, very disappointed. So what I want to do is to tell you a story about a recent adventure that we took to the 2030 that resulted from us doing everything we could possibly have done. You might like to think of me as like the Marco Polo of the Planetiers conference, here with a big tale to tell of adventure. So we set up our time machine on this street. You know this street, it's just round the corner from where you live, on the left, and the third on the right, you know the one. And we set up the time machine, programmed it for 2030, pressed go, and in just 6 years it had transformed into this. The change when it started was so rapid, it spread so fast in a way that felt unimaginable back in 2023. If you turned and looked the other way, it looked like this. And my friends, the bicycle rush hours of 2030 were a joy to behold. A river of bicycles in the morning, a river of bicycles in the evening, because we built the infrastructure, because we realized that for every €1 million we spent building good cycling infrastructure, we saved 19 million euros off the national health bill. It was not an expense, it was an investment. These signs now, when you cycle in, when you come into any city now in Portugal, you see these. You may remember in 2024 we had these for cars. Now we've built so much much capacity for people to leave their bicycles, we have the same thing for bicycles. All those underground car parks, you remember underground car parks from 2024, we don't need them anymore. They've been repurposed as these amazing, safe, free places to leave your bicycle. Now every train station you walk out of in Portugal in that 2030, this is the first thing that you see, because we built the infrastructure and people used it. The way people build new buildings profoundly changed, because we realized in 2030 we could not keep building, we realized in 2024 we could not keep building with concrete and cement because they caused 9% of global climate emissions. So instead we build new houses with more local materials, timber, straw, clay, and every town, every city is surrounded by a new industry processing those materials, even using materials made using mycelium. The Portuguese mycelium-based construction products industry has expanded enormously over the last few years. We visited many streets like this where the community have come together to get that street closed to cars, and instead have liberated it and filled it instead with children, with plants growing, with biodiversity. And the people here were very happy to show us what this street had looked like in 2024. Now it looks like this. Again, these changes just moved with such speed. And one of the sights that gave me the most delight was this: the removal of concrete and tarmac. Because we realized in those hot summers of 2023, 2024, 2025, that when you get above 32, 33 degrees, this stuff is really dangerous. So all the cities that we visited in our time traveling felt so much softer and more porous because of the removal of concrete and tarmac. We visited this school playground that had had all of its hard surface removed the year before. They showed us what it had looked like before, and now it looked like this. And again, now the de-paving industry, as it's become known, is one of the biggest creators of new jobs. It even became a citizen project. Citizens across the country were incentivized. The different towns became really competitive against each other to see who could remove the most hard surface within a short period of time. And the feel of our urban spaces changed so much. And I even brought back for you, my friends, the front page of Forbes magazine from 2030, setting out the most popular jobs with people in that year, because the culture has started to change. As we've decarbonized and localized and made more resilient and regenerative our culture, people's expectations of work and what they want to do have really changed as well. So you'll see being a depaver is now one of the coolest jobs. Being someone who's a seaweed farmer is cooler than being a rapper these days. Being a rooftop farmer is far cooler now than being a footballer. This whole new appreciation, imagination activists, urban biodiversity rangers, the culture was really changing in ways that was fascinating. And we visited this place, a neighborhood where the car had been completely designed out of the space. To visit a space where there are no cars at all, and to walk around and hear without the internal combustion engine in the background all the time was really amazing. You could hear people having piano lessons in their houses. I couldn't remember doing that before. And like I said, one of the reasons we go there is to collect recordings. So I have brought back for you an actual recording from 2030. Ooh, thank you very much. Which is actually of the center of this city in 2030, when it's full of public transport, bicycles, children playing. You might like to close your eyes and imagine you're there. It lasts about a minute, and it will transport you to 2030. We collect many recordings like that, and I'll tell you a bit later what we do with them. We visited this extraordinary thing, which was a school designed by the kids. The kids had worked obviously with an architect. They'd worked with an architect for a year to design the school that they wanted to go to. And it turns out when you ask kids to design their own school, they say it should have a rainforest in the middle. I'm very happy to tell you that by 2030, Portugal has reached its target of 60% of schools having a rainforest in the middle. Congratulations. And it's led to huge improvements in mental health across the country. People just everywhere we went, you'd see fruit trees planted, people filling in spaces in greenways. We don't see flooding anymore because we developed the humility to recognize that beavers are much better hydrological engineers than human beings could ever be. So those uplands where the floodwaters came from, we just handed them back to the beavers. We see now most of the energy used in 2030 is generated using renewable energy, but more than half of it is in community ownership. The renewable energy, the community energy revolution spread really, really quickly. It was an incredible thing. And now the food system as well has become much more localized. Most cities now building a food belt inspired by the pioneering work of Liège in Belgium in 2014, a process that started there. By 2030, it had spread all around the world. Every town, every city building a food belt. You know, having been to visit that 2030, it always makes me really emotional talking about it with people and sharing what we actually saw there. Just to step back for a minute to 2024. All of the stories that I've told you are things you can already go and see. They already exist now in 2024. As William Gibson said, your future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. We started in Amsterdam, Barcelona, Utrecht, Leeds, Madrid, Cornwall, and so on and so on. All these things, we're not waiting for someone to invent something magic. I feel like what we're lacking is the ability for people to fall in love with the future, because we keep just talking about extinction and collapse and what's going wrong all the time rather than what's possible. So I want to just tell you one of my favorite stories. In the 1960s, Russia and America were competing to put the first man on the moon. Just going back to talk about the moon for a minute. In Zambia, a man called Edward Makuka Unkoloso said, no. The first person on the moon is going to be a young woman from Zambia. He announced the Zambian space program. He took over an abandoned farm and turned it into his space training center. In this article, he says, I make them swing, this is talking about his astronauts, I make them swing from the end of a long rope. When they reach the highest point, I cut the rope. This produces the feeling of free fall. He wrote letters to governments all around the world and said, please send me millions of dollars. Nobody sent him anything. He trained his astronauts for weightlessness in space by rolling them down a hill in an empty oil drum. He always wore a cape as well for some reason that was never really quite explained. He was very ambitious as well. He wanted to go to Mars. He planned a mission to Mars. They were going to take 2 cats to Mars and the missionary. And in this article he says, but I have warned the missionary he must not force Christianity on the people of Mars if they do not want it, which was very good. That's very nice. But when he died, and at the time everybody thought he was completely mad. This guy is completely crazy. When he died, he was buried with the highest honors the Zambian government could give their citizens. He was a national hero because in that newly independent nation, he opened up that space to say, why shouldn't the first person on the moon come from Zambia? We're brilliant. We can do and be whatever it is that we want to be. So a few years ago, I saw a t-shirt a young woman was wearing at a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, and it changed my life. It said, I've been to the future. We won. It gave me goosebumps. It may be giving you goosebumps now. It made me think, how different is that in terms of activism and trying to make change if our role is to bring alive in other people's imaginations how extraordinary the future could be if we do everything we want to do. So I just wanted to finish by just telling you a few things that I do in my own work that are trying to help people to fall in love with the future. I feel like we need to do that in a way that is multi-sensory, that gets into our guts, into the cells of our body, that deep longing for a different future. How do we do that? One way I think is through using art in different ways. I'm working with an amazing Belgian cartoonist to tell the story about how me and Mr. Kit traveled to that 2030, where the places we went, where we gathered these recordings, who we met, how that worked. And I played you that recording. That's one of many. I traveled to different places in 2024 that already sound like the future needs to sound like. And I make recordings there, and I bring them back. And I work with Kit, who is a young ambient electronic music artist, and we make pieces of music. My brief to him is that they should cultivate a nostalgia for the future. And we're going to be releasing that next year, and we do these experiences where people come in and they lie down and we play the music, and it's like they step through a portal and they step directly into the future. On this tour, when we've been going around, we've been running workshops, many workshops here in Portugal on how to fall in love with the future. One of my favorite exercises we do is called making sense of the future, but sense written like smells. We give people a paper cup. We say, you've got 15 minutes to make in that cup a smell that smells to you like the future you long for. And then they all come back. You have to give it a name as well, because all good cocktails have a good name. And then they come back and we all squeeze into a small space, and they have to go round and smell. You get like 40 different smells of the future. The more this gets into people's genes, it makes me wonder if a company is writing a report about sustainability, you could write a report, publish it, not many people are going to read it. Maybe instead you invite people to a banquet of smells, of what that future is going to smell like, a meal of tastes from that future, what it's going to be like. Two of my great people who inspire the work I do are these two women from America who run a project called Black Quantum Futurism. They talk about time travel as a political tool. They're incredible. They take over empty spaces in their community. They turn them into what they call community futures labs. They gather people's oral futures, their memories of the future. And just this afternoon, we were here just round the corner working in a school with young people. How do we help young students to fall in love with the future? One of the things that we did was we created Instagram posts from different famous people during the time of this transition. Whether it was K-pop stars who had decided to actually turn their gigs into citizens' assemblies where people would learn to do democracy as a daily practice alongside listening to their music, whether it was musicians who instead decided they were going to be starting to grow microgreens and help the spread of growing microgreens throughout cities to build health, whether it's very, very famous people who were very well known in 2024 for their disgraceful level of private jet use, who instead decided by 2030 they were going to do zero carbon touring and were on their way to Aveiro to play a gig here, or whether it's somebody like this who actually, if they decided to want to put their money towards funding and enabling a renewable energy revolution across Portugal, could do it like that. And by 2027, they actually did, and it made the most enormous difference. So the stories we can tell along the way of how this process worked are really, really vitally important, I think. So I just wanted to finish on time, I think, by a quote from one of my very, very favorite people. This is Sun Ra. Anybody out there know Sun Ra? Good man yourself. Not many people tend to know Sun Ra. Sun Ra was the most incredible jazz musician in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. He died in the early 90s. He told an amazing story about himself. Where he said he wasn't a human being, he was an angel from Saturn. He talked about space travel as a different way of talking about black liberation at that time. He was also a great believer in the impossible. He said, we've tried the possible and it failed. Now it's time to try the impossible. But my favorite quote from him, he said, the future is obvious, but the potential impossible is calling softly and knocking gently. The more the work that we do to try and make change happen that helps people to fall in love with the future, to tell new stories about where we're going, for that to become their new North Star, to get into the cells of our body, is the most powerful and important work we can be doing right now, I think. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.